resume our recording, and we'll jump right into this. First, thank you so much for joining us today for our October webinar on finding the right data to tell your story. This webinar series is a part of a new partnership between the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky and the Cabinet for Energy and Environment's Brownfield office. So let's jump right in. I know you all are chomping at the bit to find the right data. So to give you just a sense of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to start with some quick introductions, sort of pop on the sort of the importance of today's topic, really why is data important right now. We're going to sort of introduce the basics of storytelling and connect that to the data and potential grant applications. And then we're going to wrap up the webinar today, really focusing on some reliable data sources and drawing a little extra attention to the data that we have available at CEDIK, that is free and available for your use, not only for grant writing but for any other reasons that you may need good, reliable data. So today's webinar, we've got some great guests. I want to introduce Simona, Balazs, our research director at the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky at CEDIK. Simona coordinates all of our research efforts, including our data profiles that she's going to talk a little bit about today. And then I also want to introduce Kiersten O'Leary, the Program and Education Outreach Coordinator with Cabinet for Energy and Environment's Brownfield office. And Kiersten and I have been working a lot together recently, creating lots of really great programming and trainings and outreach opportunities to inform and really sort of build those skills around being competitive for the grant applications that are out right now. But why is today's topic important, and why are brownfields important? Well, right now, because of the historic bipartisan infrastructure law, there is an enormous amount of money, grant federal dollars headed to our communities over the next 4 or 5 years. In particular, with brownfield grants, not only are we seeing more grants, a higher frequency of accepted and awarded grants, but also higher values in terms of the amount that you can request. Now, one thing that we do see in these sort of this new ramping up, if you will, is there really is a focus on community-led efforts. And we'll kind of circle back to that and talk about what do we mean by community-led efforts in just a little bit. But if you're wondering, what sort of brownfield grants may they be right now? Well, there's really 4 big categories that are potentially interesting to you. There's multi-purpose grants, community-wide assessment grants, assessment coalition grants, and cleanup grants. So depending on sort of what your situation is, who you're working with, what your region may be, what your area of focus is, there may be a grant that is specific for you, and one that really makes most sense. And if you're interested, in particular, if you have questions after today, please reach out to us. And we'll be more than willing to help talk through these and figure out which is perhaps more appropriate for you. One thing I will add is that you'll notice in today's webinar there's a Q&A function in your Zoom menu. And while I don't think we have the chat, maybe we have the chat available, but you can always add questions and answers throughout the presentation today. And we'll circle back to those at the end of our program. Okay. So again, there's a number of great EPA solicitations available right now for you and for your communities. But, thinking about grants and grant writing, why do proposals get funded? Well, the number one reason is that you follow the directions. It's the easiest way to get your application sort of thrown in the trash before it's reviewed, but make sure you follow the directions. The second reason is that you tell a really well-written story that really conveys your need. It's clear, concise, and compelling. And oftentimes that story is how you communicate your data. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar. So, when you're thinking about a grant, while this may not be exactly correct for every grant, these are the typical sections that you have, right? Your title, your punchy, you're catching their attention. There's usually a summary or executive summary, some introduction materials, the problem and the need statement. Then you start to really get into what are you going to do to address that problem or need, and how are you going to pay for it. But what I want to remind you is that each of these components is an amazing opportunity to tell your story. In particular, the problem and need statement, because that's really kind of a data-rich environment when you start to compose that stuff. But what makes a good need statement? When we're thinking about telling that story, well, we've already discussed that it needs to be understandable, well written. You need to define that need with compelling rationality. Create a sense of hopeful urgency. Not that this problem is so big that we can't address it, but that there is urgency right now, and we believe we can. Then you really need to make sure you're defining that entire target population, the communities that you're working in, and connect your need or the need that you are addressing to your organization. And this is really the important piece. You got to support it with relevant information, facts, and as recent as possible, as opposed to outdated facts. What really is when we think about a weak statement of need? It's one that sort of makes assumptions, provides antidotes, or editorializes the environment, or simply an aggregation of lists or facts or figures without much narrative there to move that storyline along. And obviously, including irrelevant data does weaken your statement of need. Okay. But if you're wondering about your need statement, here's what I would suggest exploring. Are there gaps between current services or resources? And you really want to gain the perspective of the folks who are impacted. So, I would ask that you consider exploring sort of the social health, the physical environment, the economic or environmental disparities. Whether we're talking about social isolation or crime, sensitive populations or health outcomes that we'll touch on momentarily, or simply the physical environment. What's the infrastructure like? What sort of green space do we have available? Obviously, economic indicators are important as we think about revitalization projects. And then in particular with Brownfield EPA money, you really want to think about what could be the environmental implications of this project, or the impacts on the community that we're trying to serve. So those are great sort of options to start thinking about as you're really pulling together some data. Okay. Because data, essentially, it underpins your choices, your priorities, your actions. It gives you a sense of how to evaluate your results or outcomes. But the reality is that data can be completely overwhelming. If you're like me, I find myself sort of analysis by paralysis, not knowing exactly what I want to look at, but knowing I want to investigate, often for me, more than I need to. So, we have to sort of acknowledge that up front that it can be overwhelming. And honestly, not all data is created equally. You can Google nearly any question, but if that source that you find isn't reliable, you may not have great data. Okay, because really what we're talking about here is data can help reveal patterns or trends. It helps you make projections. It often provides the context for why you're doing what you're doing. But when we tell that story, it makes it easier to process. We create what I'm going to refer to as audience engagement. A story is more impactful. It lasts longer in the mind. But when we're thinking about measures and outcomes, data really does become sort of a benchmark for our indicators. So, I like to think about it this way. There's really four components of what data can do. It can tell us what happened, why it happened, what might happen in the future, and what we should do next. And your narrative and storyline, if you will, is what you use to communicate that data, provide the context, and then often provide your recommendations for why or what you should do next. Okay. I pulled this quote because as I was researching for this webinar, the thing that kept sticking out to me was that data is great, but communicating data is really how you add value to it. And the chief economist at Google was quoted making this statement that the ability to take data, understand it, process it, extract value from it, visualize it, communicate it, is going to be a hugely important skill set over the coming decades. And in fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects a 25% growth in the next 15 years for research analysts, with many of those not necessarily being researchers who are statisticians, but are research analysts who are supporting those sort of numeric teams by crafting and creating communication strategies, because data is really only as good as folks understand it. Right? But when we're thinking about storytelling, or we're thinking about how does data connect to the story, how do you tell your story, right? We love telling stories here in the Commonwealth, right? There's lots and lots of great storytellers, but I just want to kind of make some connections here. When we're thinking about the characters of our story, imagine your stakeholders, your community. Those are the characters. The setting where that story takes place, whether you're defining the area or describing where all of this effort is going on, that's your setting. Every good story has a conflict, the root issue. This is really, really connected to your needs statement and what is impacting your community. And then, the resolution. How does the story end? That's where your opportunity to propose a solution or your long-term goals, right? So you can start to see how, when we're thinking about grant writing, really what we're doing is we're telling an effective story that not only is based in real, relevant, and reliable data, but is drawing on our characters, our setting, the conflict that's playing out, and the resolution that we're proposing to address it. Right? That's a grant application. But storytelling may sound easy, but there's some skill involved. We're talking a little bit of art and science, right? The numbers and the communication, the emotion. It's hard and soft skills, right? So it's the hard skills of doing the analysis, but it's also the soft skills of being able to communicate it, to put it in a sort of a relative context, because storytelling is ultimately a cognitive and emotional experience. When we hear stories, they linger in our mind, and our mind is able to transfer sort of that immediate data point into a long-term memory connected to that story. It really does help with retention and memory of sort of that emotional engagement or emotional connection to the information that you're trying to share. So it's one of the reasons that today's webinar is so important as you're in the middle of your grant applications, because we want to remind you that telling that story and creating that sort of memorable and emotional and cognitive response with the reviewer can be really important. But I also want to sort of share a couple visualizations. While most grant applications have limited space, visuals are still important, and you can use them to your benefit. These first two are really about storytelling. So, thinking about sort of what your narrative and your visuals and your data, how they interplay, right? We're explaining, engaging, enlightening. This is a great Venn diagram with great color combinations. The other is a excerpt from a report that really is signifying, we often start with a large background, move through our methods, we explain it before we get to the bottom line, why we're doing what we're doing. What this graph shows is that executives or decision makers often want the bottom line first. They want to know sort of the so what before they get to the explanation, so that there is a context for where the story is going. Okay. But these are two other visualizations that I really love. The one on the left is sort of an example of how to turn your traditional map, or excuse me, your table into a heat map. And what I mean by that is we're essentially highlighting with color visualization the importance or the impact of particular data points within that table, and drawing the reader's attention to those specific higher or low, darker, lighter shades. The visualization on the right is just great for sort of relative context and showing proportions. just, just as a reminder that visualizations can be very impactful, but you have to be cognizant that you do not have very much space within your grant application. So just be aware, make sure that the visuals that you do use are worth the square footage on the application page that you're submitting. But just thinking about storytelling and the impact of telling story and sharing information through a story. A couple sort of gee whiz moments struck me as I was putting this webinar together with our panelists. 65%, 3/4 of the 500 most popular TED Talks, the ideas worth sharing are stories. They're people telling stories. A Stanford researcher recently did a project sort of sharing data and sharing statistics with different participants. And what he found again was that about 2/3 of the research participants could remember a story that was shared when only 5%, right? 5%, that is such a low number, could recall a single statistic from that story. And then another A/B test conducted by the Save the Children Foundation
Hey, everybody. I think we may have lost Shane. I'm sure he is trying to reconnect. But let me see if I have a copy of the presentation. I may be able to pull it up and just go ahead with my portion of it, because I think I was up next. So let me just pull that up real quick. Sorry about the technical issues. Let's see here. Yep, we were right on target. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. If you can't, in the chat, just let me know, yell at me. But I just wanted to go ahead and introduce myself again. I'm Kiersten O'Leary. I'm with the State Brownfield program, and I primarily do education and outreach with the program. Oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. Let's see. All right, hopefully you can see that okay. But so I primarily do education and outreach for the program, and within that we do a lot to support Kentucky communities in their efforts to apply for EPA Brownfield grants. And I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that over the last several years, especially since the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA has made it a very large priority of theirs to get funding in the hands of rural and underserved communities that have not accessed, brownfield funding before. So we see that in the Justice 40 initiative, where their goal is to provide 40% of that benefit of federal investments to flow to disadvantaged communities. And then we also see that in a very specific area of both the assessment grants and the cleanup grants. And I kind of want to take a moment just to read from that, just so you can see how important that is to them. So within the community needs section, they talk about, meeting the needs, like you're addressing meeting the needs to your target area that has an inability to draw on other initial sources of funding, because, and in bold, it says, because the community has a small population and or is low income. So, and then it says, if the inability to draw on other initial sources of funding is not because the community has a small population or is low income, then the response may only earn up to 2 points. So that's 2 out of 5 points for that specific subsection. And if you know how highly competitive this process is, then you'll understand how big of a deal that is to lose, 3 points within your application. So if you are considering applying, or if you're putting together an application for this year, just remember to, include those communities within your target areas, whether that's for an assessment grant or a site that's in a cleanup grant. So the grant itself, in your project narrative, there are 2 sections primarily where you're going to rely on a lot of outside data sources. So the first of those is project area description and plans for revitalization. Within that, you're going to clearly identify where you plan to perform grant activities, kind of the brownfield challenges in your area and the impact of those. And so you can draw from obviously places like the census and some tools that Simona is gonna walk through with us for some of that data, but also any data that you've collected in your community engagement efforts. And then any details that you have about the specific sites that you're targeting or going to be cleaning up. But then this community need section and community engagement is where you're really going to tell the story of your community and, hit on those areas that EPA is really prioritizing. So threats to sensitive populations, that can include elderly, young people, pregnant women, people of color, people that are living at or below the poverty line. Any greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health conditions. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But then also, promoting environmental justice. So if there are ways in your application that you can talk about how, because of your project, that's going to advance that Justice 40 initiative, that is always a good thing. So for the next slide, I just want to point out that in this section where it's talking about greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health conditions, EPA does not expect you to conduct your own studies to prove that there is a link between your site or sites and a particular adverse health condition. But you do need to tell your story, make it make sense. And one way that Shane mentioned there possibly, there's a 10-page limit on EPA Brownfield project narratives. So you don't have a lot of space for visualization, but what you can include and choose to include, maybe something like this, where you're talking about the prevalence of disease in comparison to state or national trends. Like this one is from an application from this past year, fiscal year 23, where it's shown, there is a disparity between not only the county within Kentucky, but also in the United States. And so, you're not saying that X plus Y equals Z, but it is showing that there's a correlation maybe between the brownfields in your area and these adverse health conditions. So to bring it full circle, now the or if you can tell how the identification and the cleanup of these sites within your target area can help reduce the area's greater than normal incidences of these diseases that are associated with hazardous substances at brownfield sites, then you're really making that connection for them to the reviewer. And there are a lot of places that you can access this information. And I know that Shane and Simona are going to touch on some of those later on in the presentation. Looks like we have Shane back. Glad to have you. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I apologize.
There you go. You're good. We just kept rolling. But anyway, so what I wanted to end with on my section of this is kind of roping back to Shane and, the importance of telling your community story. I'm not gonna read this for you word for word, but I do want to point out that reviewers of your brownfield grant applications are almost certainly not going to have any familiarity with your community. So it's important that, in the beginning, whether that's kind of in the summary or just under that like project area, you're talking about and making connections that will stand out in their mind later on and throughout the presentation. So, talking about like somebody from Washington State that's reviewing your application is going to have no idea what it might be like to live in southeastern Kentucky, but this does paint a good picture of, the large corporations coming into town and the mining camps, and even making a connection to where if they've seen or heard the movie Coal Miner's Daughter of Loretta Lynn, that they might tie connection in down the road. And so you can build on this later on in your application. You see how this kind of sets the stage for talking about your community need later on in the conversation, whether that be about the downturn of the coal industry or climate change, or a lot of our rural communities are facing depopulation. So like I said, it sets the stage for that, and pulling in those data sources later that are really gonna paint the whole picture for your reviewer. And I think that's it for my part. I'll stick around until the end to answer any brownfield specific questions or anything about the upcoming solicitations, or the solicitations that are out right now that are due November 13th. Or if you're preparing an application possibly for next year, happy to discuss any of that with you. Shane, I have my version of the presentation pulled up. If you want to share your screen instead, that would probably be better.
All right. I'm going to leave my video off for now, just because I'm having some internet stability issues on my end. So I'm going to try. I'm going to try to move through this without my video, if that's okay. We'll sort of see how things go here. So, the question here is the right data. Do I collect data? Do I find it? Where do I find good data? And why is that important? Well, really the reminder here is that for really meaningful participation and to be able to get people to sort of build a sense of consensus, your data really does have to be sort of trustworthy. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be data that folks can understand, that's appropriate for them. So again, just sort of coming back to this idea of information and data really does drive decision making, not just in terms of what you're going to do with your grant proposal, but also in terms of the decisions related to approving your proposal. And I just want to sort of highlight this image really briefly. This is how we've distilled down that brownfield redevelopment process. It really starts with community engagement. How do you get folks involved? How do you identify and assess things to really start to create that redevelopment plan? So let's sort of talk about where does this stuff come from? So, we do a lot of community engagement. That's where we start. But I want to remind you that really not only is part of engagement sort of involving, hearing, listening, getting people involved, but it's also collecting thoughts, insights, wants, desires, comments, feedback from community. We often do that with these very traditional approaches. But if you've joined some of our previous trainings, you know that there is a place for these, but sometimes people do not feel as comfortable participating in these. So just be cognizant of that as you're thinking about how to engage moving forward. We love creative engagement opportunities, events, things that bring people together where they're participating, sharing thoughts, capturing information, but also having fun. And the reason that we like this, and really to sort of highlight this, is that we really believe that when you begin by engaging your community and your stakeholders, you're going to drive that long-term vision, and you're going to probably have a better probability of success through that ownership. That this engagement really does reveal needs in the community, and oftentimes the solution that we start to curate or propose really reflects the real needs of that community. But the other thing is, through that engagement and those conversations, we often identify more team members to take on particular roles, and we often see some of those community champions step forward, who are willing to sort of take the lead or have a strong passion. So I'm going to share just a couple ways that we collect some data through community engagement, just to give you a sense, okay? So these are pictures from Manchester, Kentucky. We deployed a group of students there who worked for many, many weeks, I think about 12, 13, 14 weeks. But every week they would sort of hold open office hours. And what these images show are people looking at different design ideas or elements for their community, and voting and having conversations, or sitting around maps in that office and discussing what they would love to see, why they would love to see it, the types of problems that they anticipate that solving. So again, lots of different ways to engage and get people involved and at the table and invited in. And none of these conversations were very formal. So lots of people felt like it was their place to participate. The other sort of creative conversation we love is our chalk and talk. It's a 3-sided chalkboard that's easily set up and torn down. Excuse me. It's wonderful for community festivals and events. I will send out a link to all of our attendees today with the guide on how to build and manage this. But essentially, it's a very informal process where we invite people to share their thoughts and ideas, aspirations, without committing to anything. But again, these insights become part of the story, part of the community need, part of the narrative, part of the data that you can use to justify and also dictate sort of how you plan to address your community needs in your applications. Another wonderful example are pedestrian accessibility inventories. What's it like to navigate, in particular if there are if there are infrastructure issues. Many communities, in particular downtown communities, are focused on what's it like for a pedestrian to navigate. Is it easy? Is it accessible? If we want our place to be for everybody, how do we ensure that? And these tools, in particular, the AARP has a great tool. There's a wonderful radical walking tour that's available through the CEDIK website that I will also send with this recording once it's complete. But again, inventorying, getting out on the streets, walking it, documenting are great ways to sort of capture data and tell those stories. But I would imagine that many of you may have a vacant building problem or vacant buildings that you are attempting to address in your community. Those inventories are wonderful. It's a great way to get people engaged, and it serves many, many purposes as you're telling these stories, right? Because as you do that inventory, you're documenting ownership or describing the site conditions, the history of that location. You're really diving into what that property represents within your community and how it may have been or could be targeted with redevelopment plans in the future. So again, conducting building inventories are an amazing opportunity, not only to get people involved walking the streets, but also to capture data to tell that story. One particular example that I love came out of Harlan, Kentucky. And this is sort of their quick and dirty map that they created. They simply used a Google map, copy and pasted, clipped it out, and started to put polygons on top of the buildings, color coded them, and were able to do a little bit of analysis. And since then have been able to use this effort really to tell the story of their need as it relates to their vacant buildings. Okay. But again, sometimes we have to set realistic expectations for ourselves. We're all brought to our work oftentimes by passion, but sometimes there are moments where we need to really do some analytics, some of that hard science data crunching. Oftentimes when it relates to financial feasibility or market opportunities, the pro forma on construction and cleanup. So again, just as a reminder, there's always those moments where the realities, the big vision are competing with really what's available in terms of financial capacity. So again, there may be times where you have to sort of think a little bit outside the realm of your story that you're telling, but also draw in some sort of critical analytical statistics and analysis, in particular when it relates to financial or market viability for businesses or building renovations. Excuse me. But let's sort of jump right into data. Where do we get ideas? Where do we get these? The data. Where do we often start to look? Well, this is I would call this as a great list, but it's not comprehensive or complete. There are still other places you could find data, but I love going back to community plans. I've already noted that we use those engaged processes or assessments. Local demographic and socioeconomic information are really critical. We're going to share some of the highlighted, the bolded pieces here, but inventories, expert opinions. You can also conduct your own surveys or focus groups or interviews. And if you do that, I would remind you that it does take a particular focus and good research design so that you do not create sort of biased results. But there are also a number of mapping tools available that you can access for free. And then government data and reports, because government data does tend to be quite robust and reliable. But let's talk about the sources of some of this information. And I think information that you all may want to access as you dive into some of these grant applications. The U.S. Census is kind of the root of all of this data, right? They do that every 10 years. They do a very comprehensive survey of the American public. And oftentimes in between, there's an American community survey, a little less reliable in rural communities, but a great source if you want kind of the root of the data. But lots and lots of federal agencies collect and publish their own data, including Department of Agriculture, EPA, Appalachia Regional Commission, if you're in Eastern Kentucky in the 54 counties. But there's also a number of sort of state-based organizations like the Kentucky Center for Statistics or Kentucky by the Numbers. But we're going to also highlight some of the CEDIK data profiles a little later, some of the extension profiles, and in particular, if you're focused or working with youth, and youth as a sensitive population in your community, the Kentucky Kid Count is an amazing data source for you. But let's start here with the census. Like I said, you can go to the source. This is the root of most data. I will say that it requires some skill to navigate it. It can be a little overwhelming. There's lots and lots and lots of data, lots of data tables. So you really have to be organized. I would recommend, if you're not familiar with digging into the data on the census website, I'd watch some webinars. I'd try to upskill myself because, again, it can be quite overwhelming. But there are federal agencies that publish lots of great data. For example, the Department of Agriculture produces a lot of data that they publish related to farms, ag, food systems, natural resources, but particularly, I think, of importance for our conversation today are rural economies. So again, they have distilled and presented data that is free and accessible for you, and it is quite reliable. Now, the EPA they have data as well. They also have a wonderful environmental justice screening and mapping tool that I'm going to sort of share. But what I want to point out here is that there are a number of indicators that the mapping tool allows you to map your community by. So you can see there are environmental risks, socioeconomic indicators. I've bolded a couple here that I'm going to highlight: the low income and children under 5. But also there's climate and critical service gap mapping ability. So, if you're interested in that 100-year floodplain or fire risk, or interested in food deserts or broadband, the EJ screen does have a lot of great tools and a lot of great sort of categories that you can begin to map. I will say that the EPA has developed a wonderful library of resources, guides, webinars to assist you as you use that mapping tool. It's pretty intuitive, but I would recommend watching one of their webinars to skill up just a little bit before you dive into it, so you know all the functionality. But just to sort of give you an example, imagine you were interested in your community, you were interested in sort of low income enclaves where there's a lot of children under 5 years old living in a food desert where they do not have access to grocery. You can begin to map that. So this is sort of an example. I believe this is from Georgetown of mapping low income. So you can see that red sort of hot spot there at that intersection gives you a geographic sense of where that population exists. If we wanted to map sort of where there's a high concentration of children under 5, you can click on that category and it maps it right on your community. And then lastly, if you're interested in food deserts, you could click on that category and it would map it and overlay it over your community as well. So you can start to tell the story of how those interplay sort of on the land in the area that you've defined. But the Appalachia Regional Commission, in particular, again, if you were in that eastern part of the state covered by this map, they have a great sort of reference library with research reports, data, maps, evaluations, charts, things like that, that are wonderful reference tools. But then if you were working specifically with children or youth, I'm going to recommend that you explore the Kentucky Youth Advocates Kids Count. This is a great document, provides a wonderful sort of presentation, a visualization, if you will, of data in sort of the infographic version here. I love it because it has those indicators that draw my eyes, the check boxes, which tell me something's good or above average, the X's, which tell me it's below average. So again, if you're working with youth or your project is aimed to impact youth, please check out the Kentucky Kids Count. The other thing that I love as a planner is plans. Now, not all communities have a plan or have a substantial plan, but I will remind you, tying in your narrative, telling your story as a part of a broader planning process can be impactful. In particular, if the places or ideas that you are sort of communicating are also documented within those plans, you can create those connections fairly easily. Okay, but let's turn it over to Simona and sort of describe a little bit and talk about some of the data that we have available at CEDIK that is free and easy for you all to use. Simona, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It is great to join you today and share some of the resources we have at CEDIK at college. And specifically, I'm going to talk about our county data profiles and the extension community assessment reports. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how we started providing this one-page quick infographic on different topics. It came from the need to have the information displayed on a quick, user-friendly option. Thinking about what Shane was saying about some of the data publicly available there can be easily overwhelming. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the key indicators within different topics that we provide for free to everybody. And those topics range from economics to healthcare to housing and so on. We tend to update these profiles as often as we can. And the reason why I say that is sometimes the data is not available to us on an annual basis. For example, economic one, it's really easy to update because it looks at employment, unemployment rate. However, the ag and food one, we can only update it every 5 years because it pulls data from the USDA's Census of Ag survey, and that one gets implemented only every 5 years. And in addition to that, it takes almost a year and a half from the moment the survey data is collected to the moment when the USDA actually makes the data available to us. These profiles are available by county. They are interactive and user-friendly. And Shane, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, thank you. And I'm going to specifically highlight two of them, the economic data profile and the budget profile. As you can see, on the screen, you can select the location, which is your county, and you can also select what indicator is going to display on the map. It's very easy and a quick download as a PDF or an image, and I have highlighted at the bottom of the screen the icon for that download function, right? Because it's not always intuitive which one is it, but we make them available as PDF or images. We also have the data to share behind. So for example, if you want, you can either use the entire profile, you can just focus on some of the indicators and take screenshots, or if you want the entire data behind this profile, you can simply contact me directly or Shane, and we are more than happy to share with you those data. Some of the things that I want to highlight here is the fact that we tend to include in our profiles data that is commonly in our thoughts when we think about the economic profile, which is data on unemployment rate, employment numbers, but we also tend to look at some of the things that are not necessarily easily accessible, like the location quotient or the personal income. So for example, on this one, when we look at personal income, we look at it in terms of labor income and non-labor income. And why we want to look at this is because the non-labor income usually incorporates investments, retirement, and the social payments, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, right? And we know, for example, that in the last decade, and even more so, we've seen a higher reliance on non-labor income than labor income in a lot of the smaller rural communities. And as we as you probably guess, most of that non-labor income in those smaller communities is coming from those social payments rather than investments, right? So this is just another way of thinking in terms of poverty and some of the poverty-related issues in your community. The other data point that I was referencing is the location quotient, and we include that one because it provides information on the competitiveness of a certain industry for the county. So for example, as compared to the US on average, for example, if the value of the location quotient is above 1, it means that you have a higher concentration of employment in your county than you can find in US on average. And vice versa if it's less than 1, of course. But probably a quick and easy example on this would be if we think about the equine industry in Kentucky, right? If we think about the equine industry in the United States, Kentucky, and particularly the bluegrass area is one of the first areas that come to mind in terms of high employment and high concentration of businesses around that particular industry, right? Why is important to look at both employment and location quotient? Because sometimes the top industries based on employment are not necessarily the same ones based on location quotient. For example, this is a very good example on that, where you see that some of them are, but not all of them, and the order is slightly changed between the two graphs. And in terms of grant application, in general, we tend to look at data and try to identify those areas of strength or those areas of weakness. And these two data points can provide basically two ways of looking at those areas of improvement and strength, right? From an employment perspective, but also from what makes your county competitive, or what are some areas of improvement for the county. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you, Shane. The other profile that I'm going to highlight is the county budget and weather disaster profile. This one looks at data from the Kentucky Department of Local Government. Every county, as you know, they have to submit their annual budgets. They get approved. And that data is publicly available, but it's not very easy to understand or to download. However, it's important when you think about local revenues, what are some of those sources of revenue, when you think in terms of population decreasing or increasing, right? And what does that mean for the local budget? This entire project came to us from looking at our counties, or trying to address that question of, are counties ready to face weather disasters, right? And that's why we have this combination of county budget and weather disaster data within the same profile. The data for the weather disasters are NOAA and FEMA. They provide two different types of information. NOAA incorporates everything that is a weather event, and that can be from short rain to a disaster, right? Like flood and tornadoes. That's why you are going to see higher numbers for that data point than you're going to see for the data disasters, right? Which comes from FEMA, and it directly relates to their disaster declarations. And provides information on amount of disasters or damage, on the type of damage, whether it's mainly debris removal or it's housing or whatever not. So this three data sources are again, very useful when you're thinking in terms of local budget, when you're working around disaster events and trying to figure out how or if a county can actually address those issues. The other data source that I want to talk about is the extension community assessment. Or assessments. These were done in 2019 by a collaboration between our center, CEDIK, Kentucky by the Numbers, and the Extension Service at the University of Kentucky. They were done statewide, and the website provides information for state and county reports. They are useful because they collected information or they through different mix of methods, right? The reports provide secondary data, but we also collected information through surveys, focus groups, key informant interviews or stakeholders interviews. And the surveys, focus groups, key informant interviews, all this are very important because they give you direct firsthand data and information from people actually living in the county, right? And we want to incorporate that in our applications. And it's also in terms of, because this were already done, it's also for this particular round of application, a time-saving process, right? Because you can access the reports and you can look at some of the top priorities or issues or needs that were identified by the county. Those are grouped under 5 teams, as you can see. And one of the things that I want to note here is that the report itself at the county level includes not just this top 3, but also a listing and ranking of all the issues. So if you're interested in looking at this report further, you can open it on the website and try to identify some of those issues that are relevant to your applications and see how they rank within the broad spectrum of issues identified at the local level by the community residents and representatives.
Simona, one thing I want to highlight here, because I think it's really great for our folks who may be considering an application, is if you look at this is the statewide summary of assessment. There's just a couple of these points on the right that I want to pull out. Number one, in ag and environment, this idea of less illegal dumping and littering. We know that also vacant buildings or derelict buildings sort of represent these sorts of aesthetic or environmental issues. So feel free to also acknowledge this idea or this practice of addressing illegal dumping or littering within your application, if your brownfield application is going to sort of touch on that. The other piece is this idea of fewer chronic diseases and sort of health outcomes. But then lastly, this idea that more, sort of better youth and adult career readiness, sort of engaging the youth, more citizens helping solve local issues. All of those pieces are things that can be highlighted as a part of a wonderful grant application related to brownfield redevelopment.
And I will also add to this that a lot of these priorities that were identified at state level are very similar for the counties as well, right? So within any county that you're looking, you are bound to find them, if not in top 3, at least in top 5. Right, and it's again an easy, readily available to you data point that you can use and incorporate in your applications. As I mentioned, this is just a quick extract on some of the focus group feedback and stakeholder interviews and how that's reported. I would like to highlight here the fact that each community decided on what focus groups or what populations they want to target. So for example, in this particular case, it's at their county, they decided to the focus groups with senior population or aging population and small business owners, right? So again, going back to that idea of getting firsthand knowledge and feedback relevant to your county, and as well as engaging some of those target populations that don't often get to participate in some of the other more traditional approaches. And both these are available online, and Shane will share the links to the direct links to the county data profiles and the community assessment reports. And as I mentioned before, we have access to a lot more data than we put in this one-page snapshots. We are limited by the space, obviously, so we tend to just narrow down to what we think are some of the key indicators. But if you want something in addition to that, feel free to reach back to us, and we are more than happy to share.
Thank you so much, Simona. Quick reminder, if you have any questions, please include those in the Q&A, and we'll circle back to those momentarily. But just sort of to wrap things up here, I just want to, just as a quick reminder that reliable and an impactful, relevant, real data, whether you have collected it, whether you have identified it, sought it out through our data profiles or other sources, plus your story, the way that you contextualize that the way you connect that data to your characters, to your place, to the conflict, to the resolution, create big impacts in the way that you are effective in your story being remembered and being moving for those reviewers. So again, data plus your story can really create an impact. And if you're interested in accessing different types of data or specific data sets, please reach out to us. Just a quick little prompt here, and you'll get this as a part of a follow-up email. But we have our November webinar scheduled. We're going to be talking about, what to do after the grant cycle. There's some time between the time you've submitted your application and when awards, but there are things that you can do there. We're going to talk about the strategies you can use to leverage that submitted application, how you can start to get prepped for next fall if you decided maybe you didn't want to do an application this year, but may want to go after it next year. But then also what to start to expect if all of your hard work is rewarded with an approved funding request in the spring. So that'll be coming up in November, the end of November, the week after Thanksgiving. I'll send that out to all of the attendees who registered today. But again, if there are any questions or comments for myself or Kiersten or Simona, please include those or share those in the Q&A section. I also want to thank you all for joining us today, and I am so sorry that in the middle of my presentation earlier, my internet went out. But I want to thank our panelists for sort of jumping in and taking over there in my stead. I really appreciate it. But I'm waiting just a moment or two to see if there's any other questions, any comments. If not, I want to thank you all so much for your participation and attendance today. I will be sending out a follow-up email with links to much of the things that we've talked about today. You will get a link to the recording if you'd like to go back and reference it. And again, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, or have requests for specific data, or have an interest in how you could tell your story, or have questions about how you could utilize data to tell your story, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. But I am not seeing any questions come in. That must mean we did a fairly good job today. But again, thank you all so much. And I will be following up in the next couple of days to share the recording and all of the links. Panelists, do you all have any closing comments or thoughts before we wrap up today?
I don't think so. Appreciate everybody joining us. And like I said, if anybody's interested in, or has any questions to bounce off of us, the state Brownfield program about an application going forward this year, or, getting prepared for one next year, we're happy to help.
I would say the same. Yes, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and just with any follow-up questions or any interest you have in the data we have available. We are here to help you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simona. Thank you so much, Kiersten. Thanks everybody for joining us, and you'll hear from me very soon. Enjoy your afternoons, and we'll talk to you soon.